Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part 34 of our study of the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And we're picking up our story this morning on Joseph. We find him in prison, and it would be understandable if Joseph had lapsed into self-pity at this latest injustice. And once more, he had been punished wrongly. He had done the right thing by rejecting the advances of Potiphar's wife. He had felt obliged to honor the trust Potiphar had placed in him and honor the relationship he had with God. But honoring the truth cost him dearly. Once more, he suffered at the hands of angry and bitter liars who bore false witness against him. And once more, Joseph is right where God wants him, which happens to be in prison in Egypt. But God has more lessons to teach Joseph as he matures this young Hebrew and prepares him for his work. As I pointed out last week, the prison is not like our modern prisons where the ACLU, Amnesty International, the Red Cross can come to your aid. You're completely on your own and must suffer under what we would consider cruel and harsh conditions that many did not survive. Psalm 105 says of Joseph in prison that his feet were hurt with fetters. His neck was put in a collar of iron. The Hebrew word for hurt implies pain and humbling. There was both physical pain associated with this and a spiritual pain. Fetters is a binding of the feet to keep you from running away. The binding was probably chains that were perhaps too tight and certainly chafed and bruised, creating sores and lameness. They cause physical injury and pain. But Joseph maintained his focus on the Lord. He never lost sight of God, and in that he found blessing even among the hardships. Free of the fetters and bindings, Joseph went about his business in the jail, and God blessed everything Joseph did. God gave him favor with the jailer, as seen in chapter 39, verse 21. And the jailer entrusted everything under Joseph's care. The jailer recognized Joseph's abilities and gave him more and more responsibilities, just like Potiphar had done in his home. It is possible that Potiphar was behind some of this. Perhaps he alerted the jailer to Joseph's abilities, or perhaps it was his way of just showing mercy on Joseph, assuming he believed him and not his wife. The Lord was still very much with Joseph, and Joseph prospered even in prison. The moral of this story: the Lord can prosper you anywhere, in slavery or even in prison, and you can learn and mature even in those same horrible conditions. God was continuing to teach Joseph about leadership and humility, and Joseph was continuing to maintain his relationship with God and follow and trust his leading. Obedience will lead to prosperity and blessing as long as you maintain your relationship with God. Joseph still has one lesson to learn, however, and that's patience. Joseph will have to learn to wait on the Lord, and that waiting will teach him patience. Under the supreme test, under this supreme test, he will have to be patient for years and trust that what God has shown him will come true. Joseph served patiently and waited on the Lord. He went about his business, serving the jailer and doing what he was called to do, and the Lord prospered all that he did. And one day, Joseph was given new duties. Genesis chapter 40 and verse 1. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against the Lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. In royal households in this time, with so much palace intrigue and plotting and assassination attempts, complete with and utter trustworthiness was demanded of those serving Pharaoh. Pharaoh's cupbearer, which is translated butler in some translations, and his chief baker have managed somehow to offend him. The Bible doesn't say how, but it was serious enough to land them in prison. Even though the word translated as baker does refer to someone who bakes grain products like bread and cakes, this guy is likely to be the chief cook for the king. Since poison is a common means of assassination, these two must be completely trustworthy. I would conclude from all this that there was either an assassination attempt on Pharaoh or a conspiracy of one detected, and it involved poison. So Pharaoh tosses these two in prison, and then evidently he investigates the matter, as we will see. The two were placed in the care of Joseph, who soon takes pity on them and demonstrates concern for them. He becomes their friend. Verse 5. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretation belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the cupbearer and the baker have had these dreams, which significantly concerned them, but they don't know how to interpret them. And in those days, dreams carried much more significance than they do today. God often spoke to people in dreams. While we have the completed canon of Scripture, they had nothing in writing from God. Dreams for us today are more likely last night's pizza and beer doing his talking. Joseph sees their distress. Notice how he is in tune with the distress of others and less focused on his own. He has become sensitive to the suffering of others. He remained focused on God vertically, and that fact created a concern for those around him horizontally. Joseph could have ignored them, but he did not. Instead, he reached out to others in distress. Instead of being self-centered, he was concerned about the well-being of others. So Joseph offers to interpret the dreams. Note that he says in verse 8, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." While he will interpret the dreams, he attributes all the credit to God. He understands that God will show him the meaning of these dreams. The cupbearer's dream, verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Note that the grapes form naturally, and the wine comes directly from the natural grape to the king's cup. The wine should be seen as pure and free of any contaminants like poison. And the cupbearer is once more serving the wine to Pharaoh. Verse 12. Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. So Joseph interprets the dream and tells the cupbearer he's going to be restored to his position in 3 days. Lift up your head here implies going from a downcast condition to one of restored happiness. Verse 14. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house, for I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. So Joseph's not waiting on the Lord. He pleads his case to the cupbearer and asks him to remember him to Pharaoh and the injustice he has experienced. He was stolen from his family and did nothing that should have caused him to be thrown in prison. He has indeed been treated unfairly, but all this is God's doing. Joseph was right where God wanted him because God was maturing him. But Joseph has had enough and wants out. He's failing the patience tests. Verse 16. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head. And the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Seeing the cupbearer has gotten a positive interpretation of the dream, of his dream, the baker asked to have his dream interpreted. So Joseph replies that the 3 days, 3 baskets rather, are 3 days. The fact that the birds are eating what was to be Pharaoh suggests that he won't be serving it to Pharaoh. And Joseph tells him rather bluntly, in 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you. The word translated lift up is a word that means to bear or carry as in a way, implying that the head of the baker will be separated from his body. He will be hanged, and it seems that it will be violent enough to separate its head from his body. Verse 20. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all the servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them, and the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So Pharaoh evidently completed his investigation, and just as Joseph had interpreted, 3 days later, Pharaoh restored the cupbearer to his position and hanged the chief baker. In chapter 40 closes with this disturbing verse. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Poor Joseph is left in prison for another 2 whole years. Patience. Joseph failed the patience test when he asked the cupbearer to remember him to Pharaoh, and that cost him another 2 years of faith-building exercises. In the New Testament, James has something to say about this. James 1:2. He says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. That term, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Steadfastness is translated as patience in other translations. The patient believer is a mature believer, complete and lacking nothing. Or more correctly, the mature believer is a patient believer, willing to wait on the Lord's timing in all things. Patience requires faith. Those without faith are like the wind-blown waves of the sea, tossed about by the trials and tribulations of life. In our James passage, he tells us a double-minded man is unstable. Maturity demands stability in all things. God needs Joseph to be a spiritually mature believer for him to use him as he plans to do. Joseph must learn patience, and he will. He will wait 2 more years in that prison before the cupbearer will remember him, and God will call him out for his purpose. 2 more years before Joseph finally gains the exact qualities that God has been trying to build in him. 2 more years before Joseph will be ready. How many more years for you before God says you're ready? So Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Joseph has been in training as God developed his character. First, he learned humility at the hands of his brothers, then his master Potiphar, and then the jailer. Along the way, he learned administration, running the household of Potiphar, and later his entire estate. He learned administration under the jailer while in prison. He developed a servant's heart under his slave master Potiphar and the jailer. It manifested itself when he befriended the cupbearer and the baker. He learned to wait on God. All along, he kept his focus on God, and with one exception recorded in Scripture, he kept his faith in God. That one time is when he trusted in the cupbearer to plead his case before Pharaoh. For that era, God kept him in training for 2 more years. But now Joseph is ready to get off the bench and get into the game. He has been trained and conditioned to be the instrument through whom God will work, not only in Egypt, but in preserving the Hebrew race. The little uppity kid, born to privilege, loved by his father and hated by his brothers, is about to become the means through which God will preserve his chosen people. But first, we have to deal with getting Joseph out of prison. That's off the bench and into the game. Joseph is still languishing in prison and still experiencing undeserved suffering for things he did not do. 2 long and agonizing years experiencing the harsh conditions of a primitive Egyptian prison and all the suffering associated with that. Sure, he has responsibilities in prison, which he is executing faithfully, and that probably brings him some measure of relief from the harsh conditions of prison life. At least he has something constructive to do. But Joseph wakes up every morning knowing 2 things. First, he's there unjustly, a completely unfair punishment. That's something very hard to live with. And secondly, he's not free. We cherish freedom. Imagine having it taken away unfairly. Imagine also that except for God, there's no one to turn to, no attorney, no judge, no nothing. Joseph has nothing by way of human assurance that this will end someday. For all he knows, he will die there. He only knows he trusts God to see him through this trial. And if prison is what God wants for Joseph, he has become reconciled to that fact. But God has other plans for Joseph. Genesis 41:1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed on the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile, and the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed the second dream. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them was sprouted 7 ears thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the musicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but none could interpret them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh knows there's something in these dreams he needs to understand. His spirit was troubled, and the word means to be beaten or troubled, suggesting that Pharaoh was very upset over this dream. It nagged at him, and he knew he must find a way to interpret its meaning because he was sure its meaning had great significance. So he called all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. And these are 2 different kinds of people. Magicians were men who dabbled in the black arts and were in contact with the spirit world, demons. They were priests and warlocks and soothsayers and palm readers and shamans and mediums and spiritualists and diviners of the occult, and not in a good sense, spiritualists. The wise men, on the other hand, were learned men, mainly elders with worldly experience who were able to apply that experience and draw conclusions that might have some validity. These might be likened to presidential advisors, smart, learned people to whom the president would go for advice. So Pharaoh told him his dreams, but there's none that could interpret them to Pharaoh. None could interpret the dream, not the wise, learned men of Egypt, or even those whose job it was to interpret dreams, the magicians. Verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offense today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker into custody of the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. The cupbearer spoke up. He said, I remember my offense today. Offense is translated as false in other versions and is false in other versions, and is sometimes translated as sins. The cupbearer thinks of his failure to remember Joseph until now as a severe fault. Joseph befriended him in prison and helped him. And what did he do when he was released and restored, just like Joseph said he would be? Nothing. He forgot about Joseph. He's probably a little perplexed that he had forgotten someone who had so succored him while in prison. The Hebrew word translated I remember in the particular stem that it's used in means to be caused to remember. Does he mean that this incident prompted him to remember, or did God prompt it? The cupbearer probably means the incident prompted his memory, but the writer Moses probably means God did the providential act of reminding the cupbearer some 2 years after Joseph asked him to remember him to Pharaoh. All along, God has been in control of Joseph's circumstances, and he has done so for Joseph's good. God calls the cupbearer to forget about Joseph because Joseph and the circumstances that would make Joseph needed and significant were not yet in place. And Joseph also needed to learn a bit more patience. Had the cupbearer remembered Joseph 2 years before and brought him and the amazing story of how he interpreted dreams accurately to Pharaoh's attention, Joseph would have been nothing more than a novelty like the occult magicians in Pharaoh's court. Instead of a novelty, Joseph is about to become a national treasure. God works all things together for good, but that needs to be on his timing. The cupbearer goes on to describe the incident that took place 2 years before. Verse 12. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So the cupbearer describes the incident of how accurate Joseph's interpretations of the dream were. So Joseph was impressed. Out of options, since his regular sources had failed him, he sends for Joseph. Verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So Joseph was brought quickly to Pharaoh. And there's a sense of urgency here. Pharaoh's perplexed, and a perplexed Pharaoh is a dangerous Pharaoh. Notice what Joseph did. He shaved and changed his clothes. He could have come as he was. After all, it wasn't Joseph's fault. He was dirty and wearing rags. But he shaved and changed clothes. And the Egyptians were clean shaven, face and head. So Joseph shaved both. He changed clothes, and it is believed he took on the dress of Egyptians. Paul has something to say about what Joseph is doing in 1 Corinthians. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 9:19. And Paul says this, For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside of the law, not being outside of the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Paul did not emphasize himself, but rather emphasis was placed on the message. Paul tried to blend in to the extent that he did not compromise his moral principles. Joseph is doing the same thing. He has learned his lessons. He is humble. He is not seeking to draw attention to himself because he clearly understands his power is not of himself, and he wishes to give credit where credit is due. Pharaoh says he understands Joseph can interpret dreams. So in verse 16, Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Joseph replies that he has no power but that which is given him by God. I can't interpret dreams, but God can, and will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. An answer is in the Hebrew, and it means to testify or give witness. The idea is to give a sincere and trustful answer that can be trusted. Favorable is the Hebrew word shalom, which is used primarily in greeting and usually as a blessing, as in wishing peace and prosperity on the one so greeted. Here it carries more of a connotation of completeness in the sense the interpretation of the dream will be complete and understandable such that Pharaoh will feel at peace with its accuracy, which he will do, even though the prophecy contained in the dream is a dreadful one and would hardly be considered something that would produce peace to a non-believer like Pharaoh. So Pharaoh tells his dream to Joseph. Verse 17. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed on the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I've never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I woke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing up on one stalk and good. 7 ears withered thin and blighted by the east wind sprouted after it. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain them to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all of the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Wow. So Joseph interprets the dreams as God told him. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. He had to reveal his plan through 2 people. If Joseph alone had the dream and the interpretation, Pharaoh would not have listened or heeded the warning. Pharaoh had to be part of the process and be worried about its meaning to believe an answer from God's designated hitter. This is all the providential actions of God. Bob Thiem would have said, Jesus Christ controls history. We still make free will choices within the sovereign context of God's control. Joseph tells Pharaoh that 7 years of plenty are coming, in which the harvest will be bountiful, but following that will be 7 years of famine, and that plenty will be forgotten. The famine will be worse than bad. It will consume the land. The word consume refers to complete devastation. There is no avoiding these 7 years of famine. He says, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. The 14 years are about to start. Joseph continues and suggests how Pharaoh should deal with this problem. Verse 33. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Joseph has had extensive training as a servant and as an administrator. And here's that training coming out. Joseph knows this plan to store and ration food will not work without an able administrator, that is, a discerning and wise man. Was he promoting himself? I don't think so, because Joseph has been a prisoner in Pharaoh's prison for the last few years. So why would he think that Pharaoh would promote someone from the lowest position in Egypt to such an extremely high one? Joseph is a very humble person at this point, and is expressing an understanding based on his personal experience. So Pharaoh listens and he heeds. Verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Note the qualifying requirement for success in his plan, a man in whom is the Spirit of God. Pharaoh's probably setting up his court for what he is about to do. He believes that Joseph has an inside track to God, just as Potiphar and the jailer understood. Joseph has an honest witness before men that he is a man of God, and the Spirit of God is with him. The question arises, does Pharaoh now believe in God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I don't think that's what the text is saying. I believe the implication is that Pharaoh believes that Joseph has a kind of connection with some God, but one who is obviously powerful. However, by elimination, that could mean the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all of the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took a signet ring from his hand and put it in Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in the second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Once more, God has managed in great detail all the things of Joseph's life, and God, not Pharaoh, promoted him over all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Once more, God has Joseph right where he wants him, right where he needs to be used by God to further his own plan for the Hebrews and ultimately all of mankind. Joseph has gone from a position of authority within his own household back in the land of Canaan to a position he was not at the time prepared to hold, in which he was somewhat clumsy in administrating his authority. His brothers hated him, plotted his death, and sold him into slavery. And he ended up in Egypt, far from his family, his home, and anything he knew except God. Once a slave in the household of Potiphar, Joseph went from this low position to one of great authority. Unfairly accused of attempted rape, he was sentenced to what in most cases amounted to a death sentence in an Egyptian prison. And even there, just as he had done in Potiphar's household, he served God and kept his focus not on his circumstances, but on the author of his circumstances. Joseph kept his faith. He had one failing while in prison, and that was attempting to swap his timing for God's time. God, in effect, said, no, 2 more years for you. Then you will be ready. Then I will be ready to use you to do mighty and wondrous things. Now Joseph is in a position of great authority in Egypt and during a time in history that will be significant for both Egypt and his own Hebrew kin. And that concludes our class for today. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments on our boy Joseph?
interesting how not only in this lesson, but in the previous 3 or 4 lessons, God weaves his path of planning, and it's all based on faith. It all goes back to the requirement that we have faith. It's inexorable and undeniable, and it's the common thread in what we've been studying.
Yeah.
And if you don't have it, you're gonna sooner or later get it, or else you're not gonna be in a position to move forward.
I think all of us can look back on our lives and we can see places where God was moving. We didn't realize it at the time, but he was definitely moving in our lives and maneuvering us into a position he wanted us in to do whatever he was calling us to do.
Yeah, and we all have so much trouble with patience. I know I do.
Yeah.
Lord, give me patience and give it to me now. That's what's the prayer. And it's just so hard to wait because we see our mortal bodies, and we know the clock's ticking, and we want something to happen so we can get on with it and turn the page and get to the next thing. Okay, I've been here, I've done that, so what's next? But it doesn't work like that. And I guess wisdom is needed to understand that you've got to have faith, and only with that will you be able to turn that page.
Yeah. Precisely.
I find a couple of things interesting here, Wayne, as you go through this. Is one, we know Potiphar could have had Joseph executed for attempted rape, but he didn't, which leads me to believe Potiphar didn't believe his wife, but that was the only thing for him to do. And so it was out of his kindness he put him in prison. And I think it was out of his kindness. I think the jailer recognized that from input from Joseph. Again, that's just my opinion. But what I find interesting here is the 2 years of patience. I tend to agree with what you said is patience, but God's timing was 2 years. He let him out right when he did the cupbearer. Obviously, that wasn't the time. And who knows? So it was all in God's control. And the cupbearer and the baker, we're in the middle of a Nehemiah study, and we don't recognize the cupbearer. If the cupbearer has a sad face and they're not cheering the king up, the king could have them executed. So we don't know what the cupbearer did or what the baker did, but obviously the baker probably had some plot that was figured out, and the cupbearer may have had a sadness to him, and it was really nothing, and he took him back in. So the other thing is, you talked about he shaved and he changed clothes, and that goes back to anybody being presented in front of Pharaoh, just like presented in front of the king, has to be presented acceptable, or that coming in shabby may automatically reject him, and he could probably be executed by Pharaoh for coming in not presenting himself to Pharaoh appropriately. We don't grasp the power of these kings and the pharaohs of Egypt. We don't gain the absolute power they had in their hands in today's time. So I found that very interesting as you went through that, but also found interesting as a cupbearer and Nehemiah, you get some things. I look at Pharaoh and I look at Nebuchadnezzar and I look at Joseph and I look at Daniel and look at it almost seems Joseph is a type of Daniel and Daniel's a type of Joseph. When you look at their stories, you had two powerful kings, both believed in some God, but probably not the God of the Hebrews, and recognized the power of that God, but never came to that until, of course, Nebuchadnezzar was forced to eat grass. We won't get into that, but I just found that all that, how it ties, you know how I am, it ties all the Bible together as we go through it. So I appreciate it very much. Very much good study.
One thing you may wind up picking up on, and it's coming up in a future class, probably a few weeks away, is that Joseph is a picture of Christ.
Oh, I agree. I agree
So
with that as well.
Look at those things in that context. The dots all start to fall into place.
Yeah.
And I'll detail that in a later class.
You had mentioned your next study. Have you decided?
Mention what?
Your next study.
I have not. I'm praying about it, and like right now I'm kind of leaning towards continuing into Exodus.
Yeah. I just wanted to support that. I agree because it's a continuation of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you drop Genesis, you got more to it, and you need the next section. So that was my opinion. I didn't know whether you made a decision or not, but I support going into Exodus. I think that would be great.
Good.
Yeah, me too.
I second. All in favor? Say aye.
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 Hey, when you end Genesis, it's almost like keep going. Whether there's more.
Lane, I'd like to make a comment on the word patience, since it's brought up in this particular reading of Genesis. Chuck identified the subject of patience also. I look at patience in a grammatical sense as being something that exists only in the present tense. Consider that for a moment. Patience is something that exists only in the present tense.
You're right.
Charlie LaBiche can't go to a patience and savings loan association and deposit some of Charlie's patience. The institution would tell Chuck, I'm sorry, there's no patience in here that I can lend you either. We don't save and we don't lend patience. Patience is something that's only used in the present tense, and it's only used when there is a trial. When there's a trial, it's correlated to a trial. In other words, you don't need patience if you don't have a trial. You only need patience when you have a trial. So I caution people in praying for future patience from God, because God probably will say, okay, Chuck, here comes some patience, and along with it, here comes some trials, and you can use the patience to deal with those trials, and you asked for it, so you got it. So I encourage people to look at patience, prayer, and God in this context. Thank you, Lord, for all the patience that you've given me, it being a gift from God, not it, just like Joseph recognized that's from God. And so it's not like, oh, Lord, aren't you proud of me? I used all my own patience to deal with these trials for these past couple of years. Thank God for the patience that God gave you. Thank God for giving you the wisdom to use the patience in the trials. Could you imagine God saying, hey, Chuck, I sent you all that patience. Why didn't you use it? It's like, what were you expecting? You were expecting deliverance, and I sent you the patience so that you could get through the storm of your life. So that's enough. Thank y'all for being patient while you listened to my comments.
Hey, Colin,
By the way,
I have a question for you.
I'm ready.
What is continued patience? If patience is in present, what is the continuation of patience? Well, where I was heading, Collins, was my definition of continued patience is perseverance. We're called to be patient. We're also called to persevere. So I was just extending that. And the thing about patience, we see it as long suffering. And so it's really today, but when you have continued patience or long suffering, to me, it goes into perseverance. And we need both, not only for today, but we need it for the future. So anyway, I was just commenting on what you said.
I have one point I want to make on patience. And that is patience is the product of faith. And I get that from Galatians 5. And we understand that patience, listed usually as long suffering, is one of the 9 graces that are produced in the believer by God, because the believer put his faith, walks by means of the Spirit. Galatians 5:16. And patience comes from God, but it's a product of our faith to God, of God, for God, that he will order our lives. Let's close with prayer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abba, for this fellowship, this time that you've given us to come together and to explore your word and see all of the marvelous things that you left there for us to discover, things that we can use in our life, and that is faith building, that we can put our trust in you, the one true God, to see us through life's difficulties. We thank you for the witness of Joseph and how he trusted in you and how you will use him in such a mighty way. And we know that you have some use for us, something you plan for us to do. That's why you're growing us now. And we pray that we understand and see that when the time comes that you're acting in our lives and we follow your leading with faith. We ask your blessing on us as we go through this week, that we might be witnesses for you in Satan's world. For we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.